The Lodger in Room 16 by David Dixon. There was something rather odd about the lodger in Room 16, and Mr. Feith didn't think he could stand any more of it. Right now he was stooped at the keyhole of his next-door neighbour like a huge, bald-headed bird looking for worms. But all he could see was the corner of a crude, hefty wooden table which told him nothing it had not told him on many previous inspections. His innate timidity restricted his investigations to the daylight hours, when he knew the lodger must be out, and it was only during these hours that he tried the door. It was always locked. A little later, Mr. Feith left the lodging-house in a very determined frame of mind. He walked briskly in a district of empty warehouses and dilapidated buildings. Evening was drawing in. The streets were always deserted after dark, due jointly to marauding packs of vandals and a strange series of disappearances which had plagued the area for years. This suited Mr. Feith perfectly. He had on a black overcoat 2 sizes too big for him, and which he seldom took off, and pebble-glass spectacles that magnified his eyes to look like slugs wallowing darkly in axle grease. He was panting, for he tended always to walk faster than he was fit for. It was trying to rain. Mr. Feith had a rolled-up newspaper under an arm when he returned to the lodging-house some 10 minutes later. A bar of yellow light beneath the door under the ground-floor stairs betrayed the presence of the landlord within. Mr. Feith delivered one startling rap on the door with a knuckle. "Go away," commanded a muffled voice. Mr. Feith stood his ground. He waited 2 whole minutes patiently, then delivered a second stunning rap on the door. There followed a muffled curse, and the door was snatched open. The landlord glared down at the bent, bird-like figure before him, whose spectacles reflected the light of the room to look like dim headlamps in a face. "Well?" he barked impatiently. Mr. Feith insinuated himself into the room, which was packed to the ceiling with a scruffy and rusty collection of junk. The landlord shut the door with unnecessary loudness as Mr. Feith explained his visit.
"I wish to speak with you, Mr. Moe, about certain disturbances on the top floor which are making my stay here difficult."
"I haven't the time for it," snapped the landlord. "If I remember correctly, Mr. Feith, you took the room on the understanding that if it wasn't up to your satisfaction, you'd find another elsewhere. That's my understanding of the matter, Mr. Feith, and I thank you to remember that you demanded that room and made a nuisance of yourself about it after I told you them rooms up there wasn't for letting, and I'll thank you to remember that I didn't show you the top floor or offer you a room anywhere. You found it yourself."
"Nevertheless, Mr. Moe, these disturbances must stop," said Mr. Feith with determination. "I don't know what number 16 is up to, but I think as the landlord you should be concerned about it. I believe that something is being wilfully and maliciously destroyed in there at night, sometimes as much as 3 times a week, sir. There seems to be a crank-handle device in there which sounds to me rusty, Mr. Moe, and the machine's task involves a sound that I can only describe as that of crunching sticks. Crunching sticks, Mr. Mole, is as near as I can describe it."
In fact, it was intolerable. The disturbances always lasted about 45 minutes, and were thunderous, the shuddering noise seeming to interfere with every atom of Mr. Feith's body. They could occur on any night, and at any hour after dark. Mr. Feith feared most of all those that happened in the small hours, when his sleep would be troubled by appalling dreams, and he would wake in a cold sweat in the dark, and find himself listening to that infernally chilling sound, the scraping, ponderous turn of the crank handle, and the sound of crunching sticks. The paranoid degree of anxiety that he felt at these times seemed to bring him to the brink of insanity. "Is that all you wanted to say, Mr. Feith?"
"Indeed, I believe I hardly need to say more to arouse your professional concern, Mr. Mole."
"Then no doubt you'll be anxious to leave," said the landlord, turning to the door. "Let's not go poking our nose into other people's business, Mr. Feith. The man in number 16 works in a local cemetery. He would not be pleased by your interest in his affairs, I've no doubt. You took that room on the understanding that if you had any complaints, you'd find another elsewhere. My advice is to do just that."
"But wait a moment,"
Mr. Feith protested. No, said the landlord, helping him through the door. "That's all I've got to say on the matter, and that's that." Back in his room with the door locked, Mr. Feith stood at his window thoughtfully. The view here was cluttered with archaic roofs and chimneys of various sizes and shapes, and part of a cinema could be seen amidst them, its neon signs lighting up his face, dimly pink, then blue, then pink again. After trying the crossword, Mr. Feith took his Daily Telegraph apart and changed some of the old newspaper sheets on his bed with it. He worked by the glow of the cinema signs, for he liked to save on electricity. He went to bed much later with a sick lump of dread in his stomach and slept fitfully all night. The house remained tomb-like in its silence. However, this was not what Mr. Feith had expected. The following morning he rose in a very grim mood, for the constant dread of nights was becoming insufferable. Though the disturbances were by no means regular, the lapses between them never exceeded 5 nights, and last night had been the 5th. He would have to look forward to a disturbance all over again, this time with the certainty of no reprieve. Mr. Feith was furious. He brushed his teeth venomously in the 4th-floor bathroom, and after a wrathful shave, emerged in the gloomy corridor with small pieces of pink lavatory paper pressed on his bleeding jowls. The fact that the man worked among the dead and committed God knew what crimes after dark did not frighten Mr. Feith a bit, now that he was angry. When he got back to his room, he wrote out a very stiff note in which he advised the recipient that should the disturbances continue, he would have no further recourse but to notify the police. He slipped the note under the door of number 16 and waited perfunctorily for signs of response, but of course there were none. He tried the door, but it was locked. He then left the lodging house to pick up his dole money, for it was Thursday. He bore a plastic bag that contained library books due for replacement. It was dark when he returned, and it was trying to rain again. Behind the lodging house was a pitch-dark cobbled square. It lay by the side of a road that was fortunately well enough lit. On the other side of the road to the square, Mr. Feith emerged from a beaten path that was crowded by trees and wild vegetation. The bank of verdure at his right screened a cemetery of considerable age, reputedly, though it couldn't be connected with his next-door neighbour since it had been abandoned to riotous vegetation long ago. The soil here smelt overpoweringly rich and nutritious, and the wild weeds beyond the trees were gigantic, with stems as thick as Mr. Feith's wrists. Walking briskly, Mr. Feith disappeared into the square, where he met with something of an accident, for he had forgotten that the dustbins belonging to the buildings on the 3 sides of the square were always strung across its centre. He had formerly complained of this to the landlord on many occasions, for it constituted a danger at night. He'd even been able to describe a lodger whom he believed guilty of placing the obstruction, a small, mad-looking skeleton of a man with shriveled eyes and a dry, cynical voice, who in the summer always walked down to the newsagents in overcoat, pyjamas, and slippers. Mr. Feith's collision was thunderous. He was just getting the hang of his prostrate circumstances when a sash window slammed open up above. The light of the obscured street lamp nearest the square flooded over a wall and illuminated a double-barreled shotgun as it peered furtively out of a window halfway up the back of one of the lodging houses. The dry, hairless head of Mr. Feith's dustbin suspect appeared cautiously behind the weapon. "Who goes there?" it barked. Mr. Feith conveyed his identity and circumstances with restrained exasperation and announced that he would deliver a written complaint to the landlord about the dustbins. "You leave them bloody dustbins be," the old man retorted with hostility. "I saw someone coming out by that old cemetery down there just now, Mr. Feith, and I've got this here notion maybe it was you. You keep well away from that place. That's my advice to you." Having by now regathered his library books and repositioned his spectacles, Mr. Feith remained politely to inquire what the devil the madman was talking about. "If you can't take advice without asking bloody questions all the time, you don't bloody well deserve any. I've been here a long time, Mr. Feith, and I got a sharp eye in me head. That there's the devil's graveyard, and woe betide any man that gets himself buried in it." Mr. Feith assured the old man that he had no intention of being interred there. "You just hope and pray that may be the case, and God be thanked," said the old man darkly. "For there's a great evil at large in this godless neighbourhood, with folks being nicked out of their very beds of night these many years," he added, crossing himself feverishly. "And what does the devil look like, then?" Mr. Feith inquired contemptuously. "Does he have horns like the books have it, and a tail?" "You don't look healthy, Mr. Feith," said the old man with a shudder. "And that's no exaggeration. He's horribly fat and grey. He looks rotten, Mr. Feith, soft and rotten like an overripe plum. And then there's his head." "What's wrong with that?" "I don't like to think on it," said the old man with horror. "You keep well away from that place, that's my advice to you. You'll be good enough to set that dustbin up before you go, else I'll not rest peaceful in my bed tonight." Mr. Feith couldn't stand this old man, whose personal abandon and madness represented the very depths of human degradation. Indeed, it was only with a nauseous taste in his mouth that he was able to associate with anybody reduced to living in a house of this quality. He was fortunate with the timing of the disturbance that night. Instead of having to wait up half the night in order to avoid having his sleep poisoned with it, he had to listen to it somewhat before midnight, while the cinema lights were still on. The sound began with a familiar scraping screech of what Mr. Feith took to be a crank handle. This continued at brief, irregular intervals, punctuating the ceaseless, muffled, crunching sticks noise, which then commenced. Thereafter, Mr. Feith's room was filled and ravaged by the physical presence of noise. The dust on the floor rose up and hung like a ground mist over the floorboards. Mr. Feith found it hard to believe that nobody beneath heard this racket. Once again, the inevitable question rose in the thunder. What on earth was his neighbour doing in there? Even through the rubber soles of his slippers, he could feel the boards throb in rhythm with the activity in the next room. The vibration would deaden his ankles soon into an uncomfortable numbness, and the dust would sour his lungs. In exasperation, Mr. Feith did something he had often thought of doing before, but in the dark hours had always lacked the character for. He took almost 2 minutes to turn the key in his door as noiselessly as possible, and crept down the corridor to the door of room 16. The sound here was so quiet that until he reached the door he suspected that it might have stopped. The door glowed dimly around its edges and at the keyhole. Mr. Feith stooped and applied an eye to the keyhole. The light within was tremulous, and its unsteadiness seemed to increase and subside with the scraping turn of the crank handle. Mr. Feith thought it might be that of a candle, and wondered why his neighbour didn't use his electricity. The view was dominated by the corner of the crude table, as was to be expected, but Mr. Feith's attention was drawn by something else, something that he couldn't quite get the hang of at first. It overhung the edge of the table a little, and seemed to be of an apricot hue with bluish discolouring. It was badly crumpled. Mr. Feith thought it might be some kind of flexible rubber. It wobbled and vibrated with the same throbbing rhythm as that of the unseen candle, and it sometimes advanced jerkily down over the edge of the table, which seemed to strain to the same rhythm, though it appeared to be stoutly made. Mr. Feith wondered if the rubber thing might be some kind of long-sleeve glove, since he suspected that he could make out the fingers. But as the sleeve grew longer and longer, he became doubtful. He didn't like the texture of it at all. He remained long enough to watch the scene shudder and strain once more, and to see the rubber oddity on the table make one further jerky reach for the bottom of his field of view. Then he rose to go. Unfortunately, he applied his weight to the door handle, for his back was not what it had been. When his weight was at its greatest, he lost his grip. The handle made a thunderous clunk in its housing, and Mr. Feith found to his stunned alarm that the door stood 6 inches ajar. It opened to the left, so that he could see nothing of his neighbour, but it was clear that his neighbour was aware of his presence and had stopped work. Mr. Feith could hear quite plainly now the slow, wheezing respiration of the man inside, who sounded grotesquely fat and bronchial. Mr. Feith had never previously heard so much as a footstep of him. It occurred to him that he might enter and communicate his grievances in person, and it was no doubt this very idea which precipitated his hasty retreat, in which he cared little for the racket he made. He locked his door hastily and drew his armchair against it. He stood by his window, perhaps because it presented a comforting token of egress. While waiting, his dimly blue, then pink, then blue face was frozen with apprehension. After a few minutes, however, the grinding scrape of the crank handle announced the resumption of his neighbour's mysterious labours, and Mr. Feith opened his window to let in some fresh air. The following day he descended the dark stair flights in a very determined frame of mind. "What the devil do you want now?" the landlord snarled, snatching open his door.
"I wish to speak to you about the man in room 16,
said Mr. Feith firmly. He tried to insinuate himself into the landlord's room, but physical obstruction on the latter's part kept him out. Mr. Feith could see dozens of food mixers in their boxes, stacked up amongst the cluttered junk within. Mr. Mole was in the habit of receiving at regular intervals, usually at night, large consignments of cassette radios, watches, and other valuables of this kind, and furtive men visited him frequently. Mr. Feith had never been in any doubt but that Mr. Mole had business of dark merit and doubtful honour on the side. "I've already told you to keep your nose out of his affairs, Mr. Feith. If you had any brains, you wouldn't forget it so easy." Mr. Feith was determined not to be offended.
"As I was going to say, this man started a disturbance last night, and I looked through the keyhole and observed candlelight in the room."
Mr. Feith proceeded to describe what he had seen through the keyhole. He didn't mention how he had accidentally opened the door, nor the threatening note he had rashly delivered, which now weighed so heavily on his peace of mind.
"I suspect that something has been wilfully and maliciously destroyed in there at night, and I submit, Mr. Mole, that it must stop. I suggest we take a key upstairs, the pair of us, and have a look inside."
"I don't have a key to number 16, said the landlord.
Mr. Feith couldn't hide his astonishment.
"Do you mean to say that you haven't a spare key to one of your own rooms, Mr. Mole?"
"I do,"
enunciated the landlord. Mr. Feith became uncomfortably aware of one particular eye, rheumy and bloodshot, bulging at him belligerently.
"The man in number 16 is no lodger of mine, Mr. Feith. He came with the house and is none of my business or yours."
"I don't believe I understand, Mr. Mole."
"I couldn't care less, Mr. Feith."
Mr. Feith thought of something else.
"And that's another thing. Why is it that you're prepared to do the rounds for everybody, knocking on their doors for their rent money, while I have to come down here and pay mine? This seems a little unfair, doesn't it?"
"I never go on the top floor, Mr. Feith, and don't plan to change me habits. I don't need any trouble around here, for reasons you'll no doubt understand, and I'd advise you to keep your nose to yourself if it's a cheap roof over your head you want. That's all I've got to say on it, and that's that."
Back on the top floor, Mr. Feith stooped to the keyhole of room 16, but all he could see was the corner of the table in the gloom. The strange rubber thing had gone. Then he tried the door, and something unexpected happened. It opened. The room seemed to have been left for his inspection. He opened the door wider and stepped to the threshold of the room. A timid peer revealed the occupant to be absent. The object that stole his attention was the table in the middle of the room, or at least the filthy machinery that it supported. Apart from this, the room was little furnished. There was a battered wardrobe at one end, and curtains of grimy cobwebs hung on each side of the little window. The thick carpet of dust was badly scuffed around the table. There was a reek of old sacks and God knew what else in the room. The sight of the mangle made Mr. Feith feel ill. It was bolted on the table excessively, and the table was extensively strutted underneath, with ironwork, and itself was bolted to the floor. The rollers were almost as big as dustbins. One of them was set into the table with only about 3 inches protruding, while the height of the other appeared to be adjustable. An adjustable flap of rubber hung against the upper roller on the output side, covering the gap beneath. A badly stained gutter ran round the far side of the table at an angle, and a battered, filthy-looking bucket stood underneath its end, covered with a ragged scrap of matting. The whole contraption was perhaps the most repulsive thing that he had ever seen. Gingerly, Mr. Feith entered the room. The electric lighting consisted of stripped wires hanging uselessly in cobwebs from a hole in the ceiling, and Mr. Feith supposed that the furry mass of cobwebs by the wardrobe must be the slot meter. The wardrobe contained a dirty pile of sacks and 2 slugs. It also contained dozens of crudely fashioned wax-like objects that resembled the half-used candle he found under a window, a misshapen oddity welded onto an enamel plate in its own wax. There was a primitive tinderbox on the windowsill with blobs of dirt all over it. Mr. Feith could see no sign of his threatening note anywhere. He wondered why he had been allowed in, or if the occupant had simply slipped up. Outside, it was raining hard. The monotonous murmurs and mutterings of it had been a constant companion for Mr. Feith all morning. He looked idly out the window. Though he couldn't see very clearly through the rain patterns on the glass, the flat grey wash of the courtyard and the green of the trees beyond were discernible. Sometimes even these were obliterated when sudden gusts of wind lashed the back of the house with rain. Mr. Feith began to suspect that, through the rivulets of water on the glass, he could make out an unexpected form near the trees by the abandoned cemetery. He pressed his nose against the glass and peered into the rain. He could hardly see much better, and the condensation on this side of the glass caused by his breath wasn't helping much. It was unquestionably a man. He looked bloodless, large and repulsively fat, and seemed to have something black and shiny, perhaps an oilskin, in one mushy-looking hand. Mr. Feith did not think the head should look as mushy and featureless as it did. He became overwhelmed with a giddy sickness at the sight of the man. The man was gazing up at the back of the house, and the possibility that he was aware of Mr. Feith's peering at him from the window of room 16 could not be discounted. Mr. Feith ducked out of sight. Perhaps he was being imaginative, but if the mysterious man in room 16 looked like anything, surely he would look like that thing outside, like some kind of maggot that crawled out of the soil to commit obscene crimes against humanity at night. Mr. Feith believed that he had been discovered in his snooping by the very man who occupied the room. Perhaps it had been the smell in the room. Perhaps Mr. Feith was overreacting, but for the rest of that day he felt very ill indeed, and confined himself to his room with the door locked. His illness seemed, if anything, to worsen as the night drew in. He had seated himself on the square of hardboard that served to protect his backside from the vicious springs of his gutted armchair. He sat like this until late into the night, unable to move, the cold dampness of the climate drenching him to the bones. Late that night, Mr. Feith was roused from his stupor by the sound of a slow, heavy tread on the top of the stairs, and a vaguely familiar wheezing noise. Mr. Feith listened, barely breathing. As the tread proceeded down the landing, the wheezing sound getting louder. It passed room 16 and came towards the only other door at this end, that of Mr. Feith. The tread stopped outside Mr. Feith's door, and nothing could be heard for a bit except the wheezing. Mr. Feith, in the neon-lit gloom of his room, remained frozen where he sat, numbed with terror and dismay. His visitor then began to grope on the surface of the door. The sound of this was horribly soft and unmethodical, Soon the door handle was struck a couple of times, then turned. As the door strained and cracked behind him, Mr. Feith shrieked without restraint. Rotten bits of wood spat out from around the lock and scattered on the floor, and as the door split asunder, a sickening stench of wet soil and dead cats invaded the room. In common with Mr. Feith's life, his disappearance passed unnoticed by the world in which he lived. His screams wandered all through the dark corridors of the house for over a minute, but no one stirred. Some 50 minutes later, the tread of a descender could have been heard on the stairs, and a bronchial wheezing which some of the lodgers might have noticed before in the house. But nobody reported it to the police. A suspicious lodger on the ground floor might have been able to furnish the police with a description of the descender, since the hall light, unlike those on the upper corridors and stairs, was kept in serviceable order, and it remained switched on day and night. But the hall was deserted when the man on the stairs arrived. No one was there to see the descender in such detail, or to smell the appalling reek of corruption that hung about him. And no one was there to connect the screams with the hideous burden that he had slung over his shoulder, a filthy oilskin sack which had in it something half as massive and heavy, something that filled the sack like laundry and bobbed up and down rather flabbily on his back as he made his way out.